Dinosaur, written by Stephen Llewelyn and performed by Chris Barrie. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell to keep up to date with the latest installments.
Life Pod, main loading bay and vehicle pool, 1300 hours. Anyone not involved with essential repairs, maintenance or security gathered in trepidation. The main bay was one of the few places on the pod where large groups could assemble. Captain Douglas walked to the front of the waiting crowd. "Hello, everyone. We've brought you all here because the power outage has led to problems with the environmental systems. As I'm sure you'll all have noticed, the saboteur has struck again. Our engineers will be working around the clock to get power back as soon as possible, but unfortunately, we'll likely run out of breathable air before they succeed." A storm of panic erupted from the crowd. Douglas held up his hands for calm, which eventually came. "Sorry, that was a poor choice of words. Obviously, we have an infinite supply of breathable air just outside those hangar doors. Clearly, our only course is to open them, which is, of course, what the saboteur intended. You may already be feeling a slight deterioration in air quality. The trouble is, outside is a very dangerous place for us. Naturally, we'll all have to leave the ship sooner or later, but this has forced our hand and, to be brutally honest, we're no ready." Uproar. "Please, please," Douglas shouted against the din, pointing at the pedestrian-sized portal next to the huge hangar doors. "I'll be leading a small team through the personnel hatch in just a few minutes. Once we've established that there's no immediate threat, we'll be opening the main hangar doors and parking a lorry across the mouth of the cargo bay. This should at least stop anything big from getting in. We will then open the outer airlock doors to facilitate airflow around the main hangar. This will preserve the air quality as much as possible in other areas of the pod for our teams of engineers." "Captain," called a voice from the crowd. Douglas took a moment to find its source, his eye eventually alighting on Tim Norris. "Yes, Tim," he asked.
"Captain, I should be on the team who go with you."
Douglas scrutinized the young man. Was he being brave or genuinely eager?
"I may be able to help. I have at least a basic understanding of what's out there."
Tim tried again. "That's why the answer is no, son," replied Douglas. "You're too important to risk the very first time we open the door."
"I'm not afraid, Captain."
Douglas doubted that, but he smiled at the young man's courage. "I know, son," he replied kindly. "Soon, I promise, but not this time." The captain strode toward the small hatch, nodding for the Sarge to follow with his 5-man squad. One of the heavy load haulers moved to block the main vehicular hatch as ordered, but for now the doors remained resolutely closed. Its maneuver complete, the whine of the powerful electric motors winding down was the only sound. The tension mounted. Douglas motioned for one of his team to open the small pedestrian hatch to the right of the main doors. He, Sarge Jackson, and the other 4 men grouped in the personnel airlock, closing the internal hatch behind them. One of the men plugged their portable charge pack into the outer hatch controls. Douglas stood at the threshold and, once the control panel was fully powered, turned to the Sarge. Slowly they grinned at one another. "Let's do this," he said, and tapped the hatch release, inhaling deeply the warm, humid, Cretaceous air. The injured man lay in the hospital bed, a neck brace under his chin. "Has the pain subsided any?" Nurse Justin Smith asked, taking his pulse. The man croaked painfully, and Smith quickly held up his hand. "Forgive me, please don't try to talk just yet, just squeeze my hand for yes." The patient didn't squeeze. "All right, I'll give you a little more sedative to help you sleep. You'll be stiff for a few days, but a good, deep sleep now will kickstart the mending process," Smith explained soothingly, as he reached for the syringe behind him. It wasn't there. "Where's that gone?" he muttered to himself, frowning. He turned back to the injured man, saying, "I won't be a minute. Must have put it down somewhere. I'll just get another—" Justin stopped speaking as he realized the patient was looking behind him, eyes widening in terror. As the nurse began to turn, he felt a sudden, sharp pinch on the back of his neck, and his world became sideways, collision, blackness. Captain Douglas breathed in again, greedily. It wasn't just that the air was fresh, it was so new, fresher and sweeter than anything he had experienced in his life, despite the humidity. Wow, he thought. It's amazing how we've gotten so used to pollution. The air back home really is filthy. Grinning like a schoolboy, he turned to the men behind him. This reminds me of Neil Armstrong's first step on the moon. A giant leap for mankind. Being so far back in time almost feels like I should step out backwards. The men chuckled. The Sarge simply said, I wouldn't. Douglas saw the soldier's implacable face and laughed appreciatively. He squared his shoulders in preparation before taking his first ever step into the past. 1 step forward, and then 1 step back, followed by 3 more on his back. Shocked, winded, and unable to cry out, he was pinned to the floor and looking up into the muzzle of a dinosaur. The stricken man lay in his hospital bed, sedative already flowing through his veins, terror and the restrictive neck brace paralyzing him as the figure in black loomed. Viewing him coldly through a ski mask, his attacker produced a needle. The prone man's wide-eyed stare followed its point, but his limbs were lead in this fully realized nightmare. The sharp sting took his breath away, oblivion his only friend now. Finally, the tunnel of his vision closed to a pair of eyes, blue eyes, beautiful eyes. Ah! Douglas screamed, events completely unmanning him. The greeny, brown-skinned animal used its forelimbs to pin him to the ground, its snout snuffling around his face. The snout ended with a very dangerous-looking parrot-like beak. It studied him, his eyes all browns and yellows. Douglas watched the pupils dilate, Disney large, in the small, semi-darkened chamber. The eyes seemed so alien, and yet... Realizing that, aside from a clumsy foot in a painful place, the animal did not appear to be attacking him, he tried to enunciate this insight to his men. Unfortunately, it only came out as another shocked, "Ah!" Looking into the creature's eyes, he saw only clean windows to a simple soul, wide, innocent, inquisitive. Douglas calmed slightly, feeling the need to report this before anyone shot the animal. He twisted to the side, opening his mouth to speak, when his face disappeared behind a huge and unspeakably smelly tongue. "Ah!" Douglas screamed again, his entire repertoire at the moment, it seemed. The animal battered its eyelids, opening its mouth to reveal batteries of grinding teeth before letting out a squawk of indignation. Jumping up and turning with exquisite grace, the creature's powerful hind legs drove it away at an impressive lick, its head out forward, tail rigid behind. "Ah!" complained Douglas, wordlessly expressing his outrage at the men standing over him gaping. Eventually, one man snapped out of the trance which held them. "Sorry, Captain," he said, offering the Scotsman his hand. "Dinna trouble yoursel, I can manage," spat Douglas crossly, getting to his feet. "That's no what I thought was going to happen," he grumbled, a little incoherently. He took a moment to center himself, before straightening his uniform and stepping out of the ship once more, this time successfully. After walking about 3 paces, he stopped. "Oh, jeez," he said, wiping a hand down his cheek. "I stink like somebody took a wee on my face." The men behind him tried and failed to muffle their laughter, until the Sarge glanced their way, causing them to inspect their boots for possible lacing issues. Jackson stepped up next to Douglas and looked around, himself breathing deeply of the past. The captain turned to him. "Thanks for the rescue, Sarge," he noted sarcastically. The Sarge stared stoically at his superior. "If it had been a threat, I would have smashed its head in with my rifle butt, sir," he said simply. "Could you no have stunned it?" asked Douglas. "Would you have wanted me to, sir?" asked the Sarge meaningfully. Douglas looked at him askance for a moment, before the penny dropped. "Ah," he acknowledged. "Electric stun rifles, right? I'd have received the full shunt." "Exactly right, sir." "Sarge, how did you know it wasn't a threat?" asked Douglas, frowning. "One knows another, sir," answered the Sarge inscrutably. The captain raised his eyebrows, nodding to himself, pointedly not asking for further explanation. He watched the animal in question rejoin its herd near the edges of the clearing. "I'm going to call that one the mare," he said, now fully recovered from his shock and grinning in spite of himself. Jackson simply raised an eyebrow quizzically. "Well, he welcomed us here, did he no?" explained the Scotsman, pulling a face after sniffing his uniform tunic. "Although I think he must have gotten a little confused." "Confused, Captain?" asked the Sarge. "Aye," said Douglas. He wiped a hand down his shirt and sniffed it, his eyes widening in shock once more. "I think this mare handed me the keys to the privy." The cat-like figure in black ran silently through deserted, soundless corridors. Upon reaching the crew quarters, they overrode the lock and broke into one of the billets. The door slid open, loud in a silence unnatural aboard a working ship. The intruder slipped inside, pulling a small rectangular package from a belt pouch. Just moments later, the prowler re-emerged, sprinting back down the corridor and heading for sick bay, straight to the store cupboard for another syringe. Grabbing a bottle from a shelf, they filled the syringe and replaced the bottle. The black-gloved hand squirted some of the contents, leaving only the exact amount required. The quantity and timing had to be perfect. Douglas studied the lines of his ship gratefully. Despite some scorching, she was not too much the worse for wear. Singh had been right, though. The landing struts were completely sunken into the soft earth. However, the rain had ceased a few hours after they put down, and the ground was draining into the nearby river nicely. "Will she come back out, sir?" asked one of the men. "Aye, she's a very powerful lassie. I want to have a look at the explosion site," Douglas replied, striding towards the stern. "It's the other side." Rounding the aft end of the ship, they spotted the damage at once. About 20 meters above the ground was an elongated black gash in the hull. Douglas hissed as he surveyed his wounded vessel. He shook his head, swearing in frustration. The Sarge joined him once more. "We'll get them," he said, also looking up at the tear in the ship's flank, which had cost one of their crewmen his life. Remembering young Mario, he quietly repeated, "We'll get them." A huge, rending crash obliterated their contemplations, making the entire party jump. The Sarge merely jumped round, weapon up, as a vision from another world unfolded before their eyes. They froze, staring. Tim and Woodsy climbed atop the lorry cab and looked out through the high-level viewport above the cargo bay doors. The vista really did take some getting used to. People say, it was another world. But even though this was technically the same world, the saying was not otherworldly enough to describe the scene. They were besotted with what they saw. "I can't wait to get out there," said Woodsy. "I can't get up there," said a small voice from below. The lads looked down to see Clary, Henry's 14, soon-to-be 15-year-old sister, looking up at them. Woodsy jumped down onto the load bed, extending his hand to pull the girl up. Tim repeated the action down from the cab. Woodsy saw an opportunity and pushed her bum up to help her, winking at Tim, who scowled down at him. "Thanks for the hand," said Clary, oblivious. "Yeah, thanks a lot," added Tim through gritted teeth. Naturally, Woodsy laughed. "Do you think they'll let us stay up here when the doors open?" asked Clary excitedly. "I don't think that will be a good idea," said Tim. Seeing Clary's disappointment, he expanded. "It could be extremely dangerous." "But we'd be okay up here, surely?" she asked. "Didn't you go to Tim's My First Dinosaur remedial class?" asked Woodsy, grinning wickedly. "Actually, my workshops were called Cretaceous Living," Tim corrected him importantly. "Dad wouldn't let me go," admitted Clarissa glumly. "They were really good," said Woodsy. Honestly. Tim glared at him until his friend's face collapsed into laughter.
Why wouldn't your dad allow you to come to my lectures, Clary? Asked Tim, perplexed.
Probably because you're not good enough for Doka, supplied Woodsy, still grinning.
Doka?
Asked Clary. Daughter of Cap...
Yes, we know,
Tim interrupted. Woodsy laughed again, eventually infecting even Tim's scowl.
You're just a pair of ears stapled to a grin, do you know that?
He was laughing too now.
Anyway,
he continued, looking down at Clary.
In answer to your question, no, we wouldn't be safe up here. Apart from being at munching height for some of the animals out there, we may even be grabbed by something from the air.
Clarissa gasped in awe.
Giant birds?
She asked, her voice pitched just above a whisper.
Well, maybe, said Tim, but probably not like the birds you're thinking of. Many of the birds here are very characteristically dinosaur, with teeth and tails. There are some birds in this era, that is what we would call true birds, but we believe they are fairly small. However, the pterosaurs are a very different story. There are some giant flightless birds too in the fossil record, but I'm not sure if they were here and now. I'll have to look it up.
Yeah, I'll be sure to bring it up at Dr. Raptor's next surgery, mocked Woodsy. Hey, if there are birds here, does that mean that some of the dinosaurs lost their teeth? And if so, how? Too much chocolate? Rugby? Talking when they should have been listening?
I love the way you make even a sensible question sound fatuous, replied Tim. You should get a job interviewing people in the media.
Now that's not an answer, Mr. Norris, and I'm afraid I'm going to have to press you, Woodsy badgered, using his most official tone.
Tim snorted. Paleontologists discovered evidence suggesting that some dinosaur species, although born with teeth, later lost them as their beaks grew. Through many generations, they began to need their teeth for shorter and shorter periods of their development. Eventually, they were able to do without them altogether and were born with beaks.
Why is the word beak always so funny? I love it, interrupted Woodsy.
You would, said Tim. You like to stick yours into other people's business enough. Now, I like the word thagomizer.
That doesn't surprise me at all, retorted Woodsy. What the hell is a thagomizer?
Look it up. It'll make your eyes water, laughed Tim. Anyway, back to your beloved beaks. Early experiments in the 1980s provided evidence to suggest that birds from our time might still be able to generate teeth if their jaw tissue was artificially stimulated with the right type of molecules. It hadn't been categorically proven that birds evolved from dinosaurs then, so this was highly suggestive evidence at the time. It implied that our birds' ancestors would have grown teeth naturally if you went back far enough.
Tim grinned, reaching his stride.
Actually, I read an interesting article about...
I wish I hadn't asked, I really do, Woodsy cut him off.
Tim faltered,
gaping slightly at his friend's obnoxiousness, but Clarissa simply gazed up at him.
You know everything, Timmy. How do you get to be so smart?
She asked, with the frank and hungry adoration of a teenaged, almost woman in the presence of her latest idol. Tim felt the need to adjust his collar uncomfortably as his temperature spiked. Woodsy bent double, laughing at him. Oh, Timmy, he said, as huskily as he could manage between giggles. What a fat head you've got.
Will you just find something else to do? Tim snapped, the edges of his temper fraying.
Clarissa laid her head on Tim's shoulder, just staring up at him. He patted her head awkwardly. Woodsy hissed until a roar of laughter eventually burst out of him. I'm going to leave you two love pterosaurs to the view before I laugh myself off the roof of this truck, he said, sniggering as he climbed down. Tim watched him walk away, laughing raucously.
Do you love pterosaurs?
Clary asked, dreamily. Tim put his face in his hands, blowing out his cheeks.
No, he was just... Well, never mind,
he said, smiling down at her. She answered his smile with her own, and turning back to the view, Tim ventured an arm around her shoulder. Nothing went wrong, so he left it there. Douglas took a few steps forward unthinkingly. He stumbled over a tuft of earth, bringing him back to his senses, but still he couldn't believe what he was seeing and hearing. At the edges of the clearings, some deforestation was taking place with no regard at all for the environment. When an 80-ton sauropod dinosaur pushes a tree over, it stays pushed. It began with one giant neck pushing through the treetops, closely followed by an enormous barrel-shaped body. But this was just the beginning. By the time the tail was revealed, there were 3 of them, then 7, and then lots. The herd smashed their way through the forest like gargantuan slow-motion mowers. Smaller animals dashed out of the trees, running or flying off in all directions, livid about the intrusion and their impending homelessness. Once the trees were felled, their tops were stripped at an industrial rate by some seriously big eaters. The herd must have numbered 100 or more. The youngest were around 5 or 6 meters in length from their small heads to the tips of their swishing and flicking tails, but these were just tots compared with the 40-meter-plus adults. Their skin tone ranged from green to brown, some more brown to grey. The 50-year-old man in Douglas's mind wondered if they changed hue with age, as the smaller ones were more forest-coloured. Perhaps this was a defence mechanism for the much more vulnerable young ones, allowing them to hide in the trees until they were big enough to join the herd? Those were the thoughts of the man, but the little boy in Douglas's mind just laughed for the simple joy of it all, and continued to laugh until the 50-year-old man let him out. All 6 men followed his lead, some even tearfully, laughing and marvelling at the sheer wonder of this life, the force shared by every creature that has ever lived or ever will live. As their hearts soared and the moment owned them, reality began a dirty tricks campaign. The trees off to their right exploded into motion as massive animals flew out of the forest in rapid succession, 10, 12, 15. They ran on hugely powerful hind legs, tails arrow straight, perfectly balanced, the claws on their smaller forelimbs reaching and grasping in anticipation of carnage. As one, their massive jaws gaped wide, bellowing challenge, and the roar was deafening, the speed alarming. Screaming, the piece fell. The 6 stood stock still, shocked. The Sarge was well versed in controlling his fear, but this was a test he would never forget. One of the giants ran close to the men, a huge male. It slowed, looking Douglas straight in the eye, and his legs felt like water. That split-second glance was like staring into a furnace, a heart of infinite violence. The animal roared again, and Douglas lost his balance, his ears ringing. Having checked them out, the creature suddenly picked up the pace once more, taking off after his brethren faster than any athlete could hope to match. The message was clear. Why stoop to pick up a nugget off the floor when there's a half-pounder with everything waiting on a plate? Douglas was not offended. His mind began to race as his body seemed to slow. He felt such pity for these wonderful, majestic, peaceful creatures about to have their world torn apart, a vision so eerily similar to a film shown by Tim Norris just days ago. Shock dulled his mind as he struggled to process. Then he considered the new world, the bomb, Mario, images, connections, images. A sound began in his stomach, roared up through his lungs, and tore out of his throat.
"Get the bloody hell out of here!"
The spell broke. All 6 men ran like every demon in hell was after them, none even daring to break step long enough to check over his shoulder. After what seemed like an eternity, they threw themselves into the airlock, the last man in hitting the close. They collapsed, chests heaving, and that was how Commander Baines found them as she opened the inner hatch. "I take it that didn't go well?" she asked.
"Let's just say," said Douglas, panting heavily, "that you can tell Dr. Portree we found some logs for her palisade, but I wouldn't try and collect them just yet."
A little while later, Douglas and Baines observed the aftermath of the attack together from the safety of a high-level window. The small war outside had abated, leaving wounded on both sides. One of the giant sauropods, a sub-adult, had actually been brought down by the hunting pack. Tim was able to tentatively identify the herbivores as Argentinosaurus, before the herd began to move on, more in irritation than terror, it seemed, their swishing tails and bad-tempered, stamping tantrums shaking the ground. The Argentinosaurs seemed to accept the attack and the loss as a fact of life. Indeed, some of the hugest among them had barely glanced up from their task of knocking down trees and eating throughout the engagement. Far from horrified, they were simply too big to even be bothered. Prima facie, this casual attitude may have seemed ridiculous, but the Maposaurs certainly gave them and their falling trees a wide berth. Any pride of hunters can be permanently divided into the experienced and the dead. The living Maposaurs knew instinctively that one swipe of a 15-metre-long tail could send them, 7 tons or no, flying through the air to a smash landing and slow, agonizing death. To the watching humans, it was both appalling and bizarre. To the unlucky victim, the ordeal was to be hideously drawn out, a suffering more terrible than mere words can describe. Baines watched the awful spectacle through her tears as the terrified, tormented creature was eaten in stages whilst bleeding to death. Even the thick, many-layered hull of the ship couldn't completely prevent the tortured screams from eating into her soul. Douglas remained rigid, but she could tell how much the ordeal was affecting him. In contrast, the Maposaurus pack seemed happy with their situation and showed no signs of leaving the area anytime soon. The larger predators knocked the younger members away from their prey at first while gorging themselves. Through it all, the cruelly fated victims still mewed and brayed tragically. Once sated, the more senior Maposaurs began to allow the smaller animals in to feed, without ever letting them forget their place. There was a clear pecking order even among the young, leading to further snapping and posturing before everyone got to eat.
"I can't stand this," said Douglas. "I wish to God we had guns on this ship so that we could put that poor creature out of his misery."
Baines was simply too choked to speak. A full hour since the initial attack, and still the poor creature lived, its cries heartbreaking.
"We'll check back later,"
Douglas mumbled wretchedly. As he turned away, his comm binged into life.
Dinosaur, written by Stephen Llewelyn and performed by Chris Barrie. New installments uploaded each week. Subscribe for more. Visit the link in the description for free New World companion stories, available for download as ebooks.